The platform was empty when Maisie Holt stepped down from the train, and that was the first thing she understood about San Angelo. No one had come. She stood there a moment with her small case in one hand and the folded envelope in the other, the wind off the concho pulling at the hem of her traveling dress, and she told herself the emptiness meant nothing. Trains were late. Men were busy. Rangers, she had been told, kept no clock but their own. She had almost believed it too until she saw the boy. He was sitting on an overturned crate at the far end of the platform, alone, in a coat too heavy for the hour, holding a plank of wood across his knees. Someone had lettered it in charcoal, in a child's careful, uneven hand, M. Holt. She looked at the sign. She looked at the boy. He did not look away, and he did not speak, only watched her with the flat, unblinking patience of someone who had been told to wait and had decided to be good at it. 6 years old, perhaps, maybe 7, old enough to hold a sign, not old enough to be sitting on a train platform by himself. Nobody had told her there would be a child. That was the question that settled into her chest and stayed there, quiet as a stone dropped into still water. Who was this boy, and why was he the only one who had come for her? It should be said, before anything else, exactly what had been done to her, because the town would know it soon enough, and Maisie already did. In Nashville, in a leather-bound catalog that circulated among men looking for wives the way other men looked for horses or land, her father had purchased a listing. He had written it himself in his own hand, at his own desk, with Maisie standing in the doorway watching the ink dry. Marguerite Holt, 31, unmarried, hard-working, no notable attributes, available immediately. "It's the truth, isn't it?" Cyrus Holt had said, not looking up from the page, less a question than a settlement of accounts. He had folded the listing, tucked it into his coat, and later that same week read it aloud at a family supper as a joke. Imagine if anyone actually answered, and the table had laughed, and Maisie had passed the potatoes, and something in her had gone very quiet and very still, the way a house goes still before a storm decides which direction to take. Someone had answered. She had not expected it to be real. A man who ordered a bride sight unseen from a listing that promised nothing was a man prepared for nothing. And so whatever waited in Texas could not disappoint her, because she had built no house of hope to begin with. It was a discipline she had practiced for 10 years, ever since she'd taken over the raising of her 3 younger brothers while her mother lay sick upstairs. Want small, so the world can't take much from you, but she had not planned for a boy with a charcoal sign, sitting so straight-backed and solemn that it made her chest ache in a way she didn't have a word for yet. She crossed the platform. Her boots sounded too loud on the boards. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked him, and crouched, so they were closer to level. The boy held up the sign a few inches higher, as if that were an answer, and perhaps she would come to understand it was the only kind of answer he had left to give anyone. He did not smile. He did not cry. He simply watched her the way a person watches weather come in, something to be measured, not greeted. "I'm Maisie," she said. She did not ask his name yet. Something in his stillness told her that would cost more than he was ready to spend. There is a particular silence that some children carry, not the silence of a shy nature, not the silence of a sulk, but the silence of someone who has learned in the cruelest way a small person can learn it, that words spent on the wrong ears come back more expensive than they went out. It is not that the child has nothing to say. It is that he has not yet decided anyone is worth the risk of saying it to. Anyone who has ever waited on a person like that, waited without pushing, without demanding to be let in, already knows how rare it is when the door finally opens and how much it costs to stand outside it patiently until it does. Maisie did not know yet that this boy had not spoken a full sentence to a stranger in 3 years. She only knew that he had been left to hold a sign with her name on it, alone on an empty platform, and that whoever had written it in his hand instead of doing it themselves had made a choice she did not yet understand. She was still crouched there, her skirts gathering dust, when boots came fast and hard down the platform boards, a man's stride, unhurried into a hurry too late to matter. He was tall, sun-cured, a badge catching the late light, and he did not look at her first. He looked at the boy the way a man checks a wound to see if it's still bleeding. Sam, just the name, low, half a question. The boy said nothing. He never did. The man's eyes came to Maisie last of all and stayed on her only long enough to take her measure and set it down someplace he didn't intend to revisit tonight. He did not offer his hand. He did not offer an apology for the empty platform or for the sign or for the 20 minutes she had stood there being looked over by no one but a 6-year-old. "You can stay through Sunday," he said, not quite to her, already turning to lift her case himself. "We'll see after that." He said it the way a man reads a sentence he has already decided not to feel anything about, and walked on, expecting her to follow. Chester Mum had already told 2 men outside the Mercantile before Maisie's trunk had cleared the platform. He was the sort of man a town keeps the way it keeps a well, not for his water, but because everyone already knows where he is. He had the listing memorized within the hour and read it now to Amos Fielder with the relish of a man handing out something he did not have to pay for. "No notable attributes," he said, savoring the phrase like a man testing whether a tooth still ached. "Available immediately." Her own father wrote that. Can you imagine? Amos laughed the way men laugh when they are relieved it isn't their own daughter being discussed. Mum agreed, already looking past him for the next man to tell. Maisie heard the tail end of it from across the street, carried on the wind the way certain words always travel farther than kinder ones. She did not turn her head. She had spent 10 years learning that a flinch was a kind of payment, and she had decided somewhere around Memphis that she would not spend one more where it could be seen. She walked on toward the Kimball boarding house with her case in hand, and if her spine was a fraction straighter than it needed to be, only Sam would have noticed. And Sam noticed everything and said none of it. The Kimball house sat close by the river, gray wood gone silver at the corners. Mrs. Kimball showed her to a room at the end of the hall. Narrow bed, a washstand, a window on the brown ribbon of the concho. With the tact of a woman who had already heard the story and had decided not to ask about it. Alone, Maisie opened her case. Little enough inside, 2 dresses, mended twice each, her mother's shawl, and beneath it all, wrapped in brown paper, like something to be ashamed of, a book. Principles of Instruction, the spine read, worn soft. Her certificate course from the Nashville Correspondence College, 3 years of lessons by lamplight after the boys were down. Paid $1 at a time for money, She told her mother was for thread. She had not packed a Bible. She had not packed a hope chest's worth of linens the way a bride was meant to. She had packed the one thing that was entirely hers, earned in secret, and set it now on the shelf above the washstand where she could see it before she slept. A woman who has spent 10 years wanting small does not stop wanting. She only stops showing it. She had barely closed the case when a knock came, brisk and uninvited, and a woman let herself in before Maisie crossed the room. This was Odalie Finch, the feed store owner's wife, built for opinions the way some women are built for hard winters. She looked Maisie over the way Mum's audience had looked over his gossip, with interest and without particular kindness. "So you're the one," Odalie said. "I am someone," Maisie said. "I expect you'll tell me which one you mean." Odalie's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. She recovered by moving to the point she'd actually come for. "Can you cook at least?" It was not a question about food, it was a question about worth, dressed as a kindness. The way a woman might ask if a lame horse could still pull a plow, not because she cared about the horse, but because she wanted to know whether the money spent on it had been wasted. Maisie folded her hands the way she had learned to fold them at family suppers when the table was laughing and she was not. "I can," she said, "but that isn't going to be what matters here." She did not explain further. She let the sentence sit in the room the way a stone sits in a riverbed, not moved by the current, simply there and stubborn about it. Odalie waited a moment for more, the way a person waits for a door to open after knocking twice. And when nothing more came, she gathered her shawl with a small, irritated motion and left with considerably less to report than she had hoped to gather. Maisie sat alone after the door closed, and only then let her shoulders fall half an inch, the smallest concession she would make to the day. Through the wall, she could hear Mrs. Kimball's voice below, and beneath it, fainter, the particular quiet of a boy who had followed his father part way and now sat on the porch steps outside, waiting for something he had not been told to wait for. She had not asked what would matter here. She did not need to. She had known it the moment she saw the sign in the boy's hands. Eli Crane learned what mattered a different way, and it cost him considerably more dignity to learn it. He rode out to the county recorder's office the next morning, intending nothing more than to satisfy his own sense of order, to see the marriage contract filed properly, so that whatever came of the arrangement by Sunday could be undone just as cleanly. It was the kind of errand he liked, a paper problem with a paper solution. Judge Aldous Pierce's clerk, a thin, patient man named Whitfield, pulled the file and set it on the counter, and it was there the trouble started. "You'll want to look at the second page," Whitfield said, in the tone of a man who has learned not to enjoy delivering bad news, only to deliver it accurately. Eli looked. The contract, filed at his own request 3 weeks before Maisie had ever boarded a train, did not read as a simple bride agreement. It read as something he had asked for, and in the rush of the asking, had not fully reckoned with. A formal registration of Marguerite Holt as a resident of Tom Green County, filed jointly with an emergency guardianship designation naming her co-custodian of Samuel Crane, minor, should Eli die or be disabled in the line of duty. He remembered writing it, and why. A ranger who rode toward trouble for a living could not leave a 6-year-old to the mercy of whichever neighbor was nearest, when the telegraph brought bad news. He had done it for Sam. He had not thought he would need to undo it by a Sunday. "There's no simple return on a filing like this," Whitfield said, "not without you standing right here asking the judge to strike it, and even then—" He did not finish. He did not need to. Eli stood at the counter a long moment, hat in hand, feeling the particular heat of a man caught out by his own paperwork. He had told her Sunday, "We'll see after that the way a man tells himself a fence will hold before he's tested the post." And the law had already decided otherwise. Marguerite Holt was not a guest he could send back down the line at his own convenience. She was filed, sealed, and witnessed by the county, bound to that boy on a paper Eli had signed himself, weeks before he had ever laid eyes on the woman standing at the far end of it. Whatever came next, it would not be his to decide alone. Sam had been at it since before the coffee finished boiling. Maisie heard it before she saw it. A small patient scraping from the front room, leather against leather, the particular rhythm of a task attempted and abandoned and attempted again. She came around the doorway with a dish towel still in her hands and found him on the floor by the cold hearth, one boot on, one boot beside his knee, working the button hook through its loop with the fierce concentration of a much older man threading a needle in bad light. He did not look up. He had, she would learn, a way of working that shut the rest of the world out entirely, as if the boot and the hook and his own stubborn fingers were the only three things left in Texas. The hook slipped. The button popped free of the loop and skittered a half-inch across the leather, and Sam's jaw set. And he started again from the bottom eyelet, the way a man starts a fence over when the first post goes in crooked. Nobody had had the patience for this. She understood it without being told, understood it in the shine worn into the leather where small thumbs had worried at it 100 times before. A father riding out before dawn, a housekeeper with bread rising and no minutes to spare, a boy of 6, alone on a floor, solving a problem meant for hands twice the size of his. Maisie set the towel on the arm of the chair and lowered herself down beside him, skirts pooling on the boards, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his. She did not reach for the boot. It cost her something to keep her hand still. She had spent 10 years being the one who reached, who fixed, who took the flour sack before it spilled. But she had seen enough of this boy already to know what he was actually asking for, underneath the boot and the button and the 40 minutes he'd already spent on a task that should have taken 4. He was not asking to be rescued. He was asking whether anyone would still be there if he wasn't. So she sat, and she waited, and she said nothing at all. The clock on the mantel, the only clock in the house, wound by Eli every night with the same 3 turns, though he'd never once said why it mattered to him, measured out what felt like a very long while. Outside, a dog worked itself into a fit over something and then lost interest. The fire ticked as it settled. Sam's fingers found the hook, lost it, found it again. The last button went through on the 4th try in as many minutes, and it went through clean. Sam sat back on his heels and looked at his own boot as if it had done something unexpected. Maisie brought her hands together once, a single sound, brief and unshowy, gone almost before it had finished being a clap at all. Not the whoop a nursemaid might have given, not the fuss of a woman performing delight for a child too young to know the difference between real praise and theater. Just the one sound, an acknowledgement offered the way a person offers a nod to someone who has done a hard thing quietly and would be embarrassed to have it made loud. Sam turned his head and looked at her. It was not the flat, weather-watching look he had given her on the platform. Something had shifted behind it, the way light shifts in a room when a door opens somewhere else in the house. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has, without warning, spoken to them in the one language they'd quietly stopped expecting to hear again. She did not push further. She did not ask if he was proud, did not narrate the moment back to him the way adults so often did, sanding down a private thing by naming it too soon. She only nodded once, the same economy as the clap, and reached for the dish towel again as though nothing at all had happened. From the hallway, unseen, Eli Crane stood with one hand flat against the frame and did not go in. He had come to the doorway meaning to hurry the boy along. There was a horse to see to, and had stopped instead, boots rooted to the boards, watching a woman he had known 2 days do nothing at all for his son and somehow do more for him than Eli had managed in 3 years of trying. Something in his chest had gone tight and strange, the way it did riding into a canyon at dusk when the light did something to the rock. A man couldn't explain and didn't especially want explained. His hand came off the frame an inch, the old instinct rising to say something fatherly and useless. Good job, son. The kind of thing a man says when he needs the room to know he was there too. He caught it before it left him, put his hand back on the frame, and stayed where he was, half in shadow, and said nothing. Sam did not seem to know his father was there, or perhaps, in the particular way of children who have learned to keep careful accounts of who is watching and who is not, he knew exactly and simply did not need him for this one. He reached instead for the cold stub of a fence post charcoal that lived in a tin by the hearth, kept there, Maisie would later learn, since the week after his mother died, and drew it toward himself and began to work it against the back of an old feed bill, the paper thin and soft with handling. 3 shapes came up out of the charcoal, blunt and sure, the marks of a hand that had done this before and knew exactly what it meant to draw, even if it could not yet say what it meant in words. 2 figures, tall, 1 figure, small. Maisie leaned a little, not enough to seem to be looking, though she was. The small figure was not beside the tall ones, not trailing behind them, the way a child draws himself, trailing behind a parent in most such pictures. It was between them. The week that followed had a rhythm to it, and Eli noticed the rhythm before he noticed anything else. The way a man riding fence notices a gate swinging on a hinge that used to stick. Sam had always been the last one up. 3 years of mornings, Eli dressing him half asleep, learning to let the boy wake slow because waking fast seemed to frighten something loose in him. Now the boy was awake before the coffee finished its first boil, and gone from his bed before Eli had so much as pulled on a boot. The first morning, Eli found the bed empty and felt the old cold drop in his stomach, the one that had lived there since the fever. He found Sam in the kitchen instead, standing at Maisie's elbow while she measured chicory into the pot, not talking, not being talked to, simply standing in the orbit of a person he had decided to be near. She handed him a spoon to hold, as if holding a spoon were a job of real consequence, and he held it with the gravity of a boy entrusted with a rifle. Eli watched her the way a man watches a hired hand through the first weeks. With an eye out for the seam, every household eventually showed. He looked for a week and did not find one. Each evening, he lay in the dark, running back through the day's accounting, and came up again with nothing to enter on the other side of the ledger. It unsettled him more than a fault would have. Odalie Finch had not given up so easily. She came around twice more that week, each visit dressed as concerned the way a woman comes around a new horse with an apple in one hand and a bridle behind her back. A torn hem produced as though she'd simply been passing with it. A column of household figures she wondered aloud if Miss Holt could reckon. Maisie mended the tear with stitches too even to fault and gave the total before being asked twice over, and each time Odalie went away with less to report than she'd hoped to gather. It was the third visit on the Thursday that Eli happened to be close enough to hear. He had come in from the stable with a bridle over one shoulder, meaning only to pass through to the tool shed, when Odalie's voice reached him, pitched a little louder than the others. The way a voice gets louder when its owner senses she is finally circling something worth the hunt. "And what," Odalie said, "would you do, Miss Holt, if the ranger were to die out there, line of duty? God forbid, of course. But what would you do?" It was. Eli understood, even as his boots slowed on the packed earth, the only question underneath all the others. Not whether Maisie could sew or cipher, whether she had come for shelter the way a stray dog comes for shelter with nowhere else in the world to go, or whether she was something else. Maisie did not answer quickly and did not answer slow enough to seem wounded by the asking. "I have a certificate in instruction from the Nashville Correspondence College," she said. 3 years of lessons, paid $1 at a time, out of money my mother believed went to thread. There isn't a schoolhouse between here and San Antonio that couldn't use a teacher who knows how to make a silent child feel like the only one in the room. If the ranger died tomorrow, I would grieve him the way I'd grieve any good man I'd come to know. And then I would teach. I did not come to Texas to be someone's arrangement, Mrs. Finch. I came because a door opened, and I am the kind of woman who walks through the doors that open, since so few of them ever have. There was a silence after it, brief and complete, the kind that follows a thing said too plainly to argue with. Eli did not hear Odalie's reply, if she made one at all. He heard instead something close behind his own ribs, a small specific dislodging, like a stone shifting after long settlement. He had assumed, because assuming cost nothing, that a woman who answered a cruel father's advertisement did so out of plain necessity. No better offer. He understood now, standing frozen with a bridle biting his shoulder, that he had been wrong in a way that changed the shape of everything around it. She had a plan that did not require him. A whole life, sketched already in the quiet architecture of her own mind, in which the Crane household was one door among several. It was the first time he had seen her as a woman entire, and not as the parcel that had arrived on the platform with a sign around a boy's neck. He found he could not immediately make his legs carry him forward, and it was a long moment before he remembered the tool shed and went on. Sunday came up warm and close, the kind of Texas morning that promised heat by noon and delivered early. The Crane wagon took the road to the Baptist church at its usual hour. Sam scrubbed and quiet between the two adults, his boots, both buttoned now, first try, swinging just clear of the floorboards. Inside, The Sunday school room smelled of chalk dust and lamp oil. Miss Odalie Bragg, who had taught the town's children their letters for 11 years running, clapped her hands twice for quiet and told the dozen children seated before her that today, before the lesson proper, she wanted each of them to stand and say, simply, plainly, no shame in it, the name of the person they loved best in all the world. She said it lightly, the way a teacher says a thing meant only to warm a room before the real work starts. Down the row, the other children shifted and grinned, already composing their answers. A mother, a dog, an older brother who'd let them ride the good horse. Sam did not shift. He did not grin. He sat very still, the stillness of a boy who has spent 3 years being watched for exactly this kind of moment and has learned, without ever being taught in words, that the safest answer in a room full of people who are not his father is no answer at all. Miss Bragg, who had asked the question expecting nothing more than a pleasant murmur before the lesson, did not yet know she had lit a fuse. The first child to answer was a girl of about 8, in a dress 2 sizes let down, who stood so fast her chair scraped the floorboards and announced, with the confidence of someone who had never once wondered if the answer might cost her something, "My mother." She sat back down before Miss Bragg had even nodded. A boy said, "My pa, on account of he lets me ride Dandy." A girl with a gap in her front teeth said her dog. 2 more said their mothers. One small boy went red to the ears and mumbled a name that turned out to belong to a girl 3 seats over, and the row dissolved into the helpless laughter of children who have just watched one of their own be brave and foolish at the same time. It went round that way, easy as a hymn everyone already knew. Miss Bragg nodded at each answer, already composing in her mind the lesson she meant to hang on it. Something about love being the first thing worth naming, before arithmetic, before catechism. Sam sat 2 children from the end. He did not fidget the way the others had, testing answers under their breath. He sat with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes on the chalk dust motes turning in the window light. The stillness of a boy who had done the arithmetic already, and arrived, long before his turn came, at the only sum that mattered. Strangers in a room, and nowhere in it a name safe to give them. Miss Bragg had taught 11 years of Sunday mornings in that room, and she knew exactly which children could be pushed and which could not. She had never once, in 3 years, asked Sam Crane to speak in front of the others. She asked him now only because habit had carried her past the thinking part of the exercise. She caught herself. She opened her mouth to skip past him kindly, the same warned sentence she kept ready for exactly this. "And we'll come back to you, Samuel. No hurry at all." A mercy so smoothed by use that the other children no longer noticed when it happened. Sam's hand went up. It went up plainly, without drama, the same unhurried certainty with which he'd worked a button through its loop 4 mornings running until it went through clean. Miss Bragg stopped with the kind sentence still folded behind her teeth. "Sam?" Miss Bragg said, so quiet it was hardly a question, more a permission left open in case he wanted to set it back down unused. He did not set it down. "Miss Maisie," Sam said. He said it whole, not the ration of syllables he doled out at home on his hardest days, the entire name, clear, unhurried, pitched to carry to the back row. 2 words, and in them 3 years of a boy's silence broke like ice on the concho in a sudden thaw, not gradually, but all at once, the whole surface giving way after a whole winter of looking solid. Nobody laughed. Nobody, this time, reached for the next name on the row. Miss Odalie Bragg, who had taught the letters and the catechism to half the children in San Angelo for 11 unbroken years, and had long ago stopped expecting a morning to surprise her, put one hand flat against her own collarbone as though to hold something in that had come suddenly loose, and her eyes filled and did not stay dry. She did not scold herself for it in front of the children. She let it stand, one clean tear finding the crease by her nose and going no further, because there are things a grown woman cannot help and ought not pretend to. Outside, past the window with its old wavy glass, Eli Crane had not meant to be listening at all. He had come by the church on his way back from the livery, meaning only to collect his son at the appointed half hour. He had no reason to stop. He stopped anyway. Some old instinct, the same one that had once told him a saddle girth was about to give before he'd found the fault with his hands. And so he was standing just outside the glass, hat in one hand, when his son's voice came through the old wavy pane, clear enough to carry across a rifle range. He heard the name. He understood, before he understood anything else about it, what it meant that the room had gone so still around it. He had heard Sam say a great many things in the privacy of their own kitchen. Short things, hard-won things, spoken low and only to him. He had never once heard his son address a stranger with a name spoken whole and unafraid. Something in his chest performed the same slow give the ice on the concho was doing at that very moment inside the schoolroom. Solid so long, he'd stopped noticing its weight, cracking open under a warmth he had not granted himself permission to feel. He did not go in. He could not have said why not, only that the moment on the other side of that glass had never once been his to enter. The way a man does not walk into a church mid-hymn to tell the choir they are singing well. He only stood and watched through the old warped glass as his son held Maisie Holt's hand, the way a person holds the one solid thing in a room that has just tilted sideways. There are things, Eli thought, though he would never have found the words to say it aloud, not to Maisie, not to the empty dark of his own room that night. There are things that can only be seen by someone who was never taught to look away. He had spent 3 years averaging his son's silences into an arithmetic he could live with. Fewer words this month than last. Call it steady. Call it healing enough. He understood now that he had been counting the wrong thing entirely. He had been counting absence. Somebody else had been counting the boy. He put his hat back on before anyone inside could look up and find him there, and turned and walked back toward the wagon without waiting for the half hour, because he did not trust his own face to hold still if Maisie Holt looked at it too closely just yet. That night, long after Sam had been put to bed with the 3-shaped drawing folded under his pillow the way another boy might keep a coin for luck, Eli Crane stood on the front step of his own house for the better part of an hour before he did anything about the restlessness in him. He had never once, in the whole of Maisie Holt's residence in San Angelo, walked the quarter-mile to the Kimball boarding house to knock on its door. She had always come to him. He crossed it now, boards cold under his boots, the house showing one lit window, low and yellow, and raised his hand to a door he had never once knocked on before in his life, because a man had gone the better part of a day understanding a fact he did not yet know what to do with, and there was, he had finally admitted to himself, only one person in San Angelo he could say it to, He knocked. Maisie opened the door before the second knock could land. She had heard him cross the porch, the particular weight of him unhurried even now, and had already set down the mending in her lap by the time his knuckles found the wood. She did not ask why he had come. She stepped back and let the lamplight fall across the boards between them, and Eli Crane took that as the invitation it was and came in out of the cold. They sat at the small table in the boarding house parlor, the one the widow Kimball kept for guests who wanted to write letters, and for a while neither of them said anything worth writing down. The lamp between them burned low and steady. It was Maisie who spoke first, because she had spent 31 years learning that silence, left alone too long, hardens into something neither party can break without looking foolish. "You heard him," she said. Not a question. "I heard him." She nodded once and looked at her own hands a while before she went on. "My father wrote no attributes of note, with me sitting across the table from him, not behind a closed door, across the table in his own hand. And when I asked him why, he said it was the truth, wasn't it? And went back to his ledger. She said it the way a woman recites the contents of a shelf she has dusted 100 times, no tremor left in it, only the flat weight of long familiarity. He read it out loud at his sister's supper table 3 weeks later as a joke. "Imagine," he said, "if anyone answered that." "Somebody did," Eli said. "Somebody did." She almost smiled. It did not stay long enough to be called one. Eli turned his hat once in his hands, a habit he had never broken since the war, and found that the thing sitting in his chest all evening had a shape now, and a door standing open in front of it. "My wife died in August," he said. 3 years, this coming one. Fever, the kind that comes up the river some summers and takes whoever it wants." He was not looking at Maisie when he said it. He was looking at the lamp, the way a man looks at a fire instead of the person he is talking to. So the words have somewhere to go that isn't a face. "I buried her myself out past the second rise because the fever had the whole county too frightened to come stand over a grave with me. No preacher, no neighbor. I dug it in the evening, filled it back in alone, and went back to duty the next morning because I did not know what else a man does." "Sam was 3, Eli said. "Old enough to know she was gone, not old enough to have the words for it. I told myself that first year he'd get the words back on his own time. By the 3rd year, I'd stopped telling myself anything. I just kept counting the days he didn't talk and called the counting a kind of hope." Maisie did not offer him comfort shaped like a sentence. She let the account sit in the room a while, the way a person lets a wound air before dressing it, and when she finally spoke, it was not a consolation, but a recognition, plain as a nail driven straight. "You buried her alone and went back to work the next day because grief with no one watching doesn't feel like a thing you're allowed to take a day for." "That's it exactly," Eli said, and something in his shoulders came down an inch, the way a load settles once it's been shifted onto a second pair of hands. They sat with that a while. Two people who had each spent years being underestimated in their private griefs, neither needing the other to say more than had already been said. It was not romance. It was the plainer, harder thing that sometimes comes before romance and sometimes never becomes it at all. It was Maisie, finally, who asked the question she had been turning over since the platform. "Why did you answer the advertisement?" "Mine, of all of them. There must have been a dozen in that catalog." Eli took his time with it. He was a man who had learned over 11 years of ranger service that the true answer to a question was usually shorter than the one that came first to mind, and that the shorter one cost more to give. "Because it said available immediately," he said. Maisie waited, certain there was more, and there was. "Sam needed somebody who wouldn't be leaving the minute it got hard," Eli said. "Every other bride in that catalog sounded like she was hoping for a courtship. I didn't have time to offer one. Yours was the only advertisement that read like it already knew what waiting cost. I didn't marry a description on a page, Miss Holt. I answered a woman who wasn't asking to be spared anything." Maisie looked at him a long moment and did not trust herself to answer that plainly, so she reached instead for the practical end of the evening, the way she always did when a room threatened to hold more than she was ready to carry. Eli left a little before 10, out into the cold with his hat already back on, and did not trust his own face either, which was its own kind of answer. He was crossing the square the next morning when Chester Mum called out and handed him a single letter, postmarked Nashville, the hand on the envelope precise and unmistakably a woman's, Eunice Holt's, not Cyrus's. Eli did not open it in the street. He carried it as far as the shade of the livery overhang, where no one would think to watch a ranger read his mail, and broke the seal there. He read it once quickly, the way a man reads bad news he already half expected. Then a second time, slower, to be certain he had not mistaken a word of it. He did not go looking for Maisie. He folded the letter along its original crease and put it in his breast pocket, where it sat through the rest of the morning like a stone he had swallowed and could not yet decide how to speak of. The days that followed took on a shape Eli almost recognized as ordinary, and he was careful with that word, turning it over before he let himself trust it, the way a man tests ice before he puts his full weight on it. He moved the letter the second night from his coat to the tin box on the shelf where he kept discharge papers and a photograph too faded to show anyone, a kind of putting it away, though a part of him understood he had only put it where he would have to look at it again on purpose. Sam, meanwhile, was undoing 3 years in the space of a week. It did not come all at once. It came the way water finds a crack it has been looking for the whole time. Patient, then suddenly, everywhere. 2 mornings after the church, Sam stood at the stove where Maisie was turning eggs and said, "Too hot," and pointed at the pan, and it was 3 words, plain and correct. And Maisie did not make a thing of it. She only said, "You're right," and moved the pan and let the moment pass like any other moment in a kitchen. By the end of that week, he had built whole sentences, short ones, the kind a boy his age ought to have been building for a year already, if the world had been kinder to him. He said Eli's name to Eli's face on a Tuesday, a small thing. "Pa, look," holding up a horseshoe he'd found rusting by the well. And Eli looked at the horseshoe for a long moment, because looking at his son's face would have undone him faster than he wanted, undone in broad daylight. Word of the church moved through San Angelo the way water moves through dry ground. Nobody saw it travel, and then the whole field was wet. By Thursday, it had reached Chester Mum second hand and third hand, smoothed by then into something almost like a parable. The Crane boy struck dumb 3 years and made to speak again, and by whom? Mum had been the one to read the Holt advertisement aloud on the platform the day Maisie arrived. No attributes of note, available immediately, with the particular relish of a man who enjoys being the one holding the news before anyone else has it. He had not thought of it since as anything but a good story for a slow week. He thought of it differently now. He crossed her path outside the mercantile on Friday, Maisie with a basket over one arm and Sam trotting a half-step behind her, reciting unprompted the names of the horses at the livery in order of size, and Chester Mum took his hat off a full 3 seconds before courtesy required it, and said, "Morning, Miss Holt," in a voice pitched lower than the one he used for the rest of the street, not quite meeting her eyes when he said it. It was, all of it, the closest thing to peace the house had held in 3 years, and Eli was superstitious enough about peace to be careful with it, the way a man is careful setting down something he is not sure will hold his weight twice. He still had not told her about the letter. He told himself there would be a right evening for it, a right way into the sentence, and each evening that arrived seemed wrong in some small particular. Sam still awake, or the two of them too tired, or the peace in the room too new and too easily cracked. He was a man who had buried a wife alone rather than ask the county to grieve with him, and old habits, he was learning, did not loosen just because a boy had started saying more than 3 words a day. He was still turning the wrong evenings over in his mind. On the Saturday, a boy from the livery came running up the road toward the house, breathless, to say that a carriage had been sighted coming up from the south. A good carriage, hired, not one of the county's own, moving at the unhurried pace of people who had paid enough not to be jolted. By the time it reached the edge of San Angelo, half the town had found some reason to be standing where they could see the road. The carriage stopped in front of the Kimball house, and a gloved hand found the step first, and then the rest of her followed it into the Texas light. A young woman in traveling silk, the color of a robin's egg, dust-free in a way that spoke of care, taken at every stop along the road, her hair arranged with a precision no wind between Nashville and San Angelo had been permitted to disturb. She was, in every particular, the Holts of Nashville would have listed in a catalog without hesitation, a young woman of considerable and notable attributes. Adeline Rourke had arrived. Chester Mum had never in his life been a patient man where news was concerned, and the letter Adeline Rourke's driver placed in his hands that morning was, by his own private reckoning, the finest piece of news to pass through San Angelo in a decade. He carried it to the mercantile the way a man carries a thing he intends to be seen carrying, and by the time he had crossed the square, a dozen people had arranged themselves inside in the loose, unhurried way of a town that has heard a carriage arrived yesterday and means to find out why. He broke the seal at the counter in front of all of them and read it aloud in the voice he kept for auctions and church notices, pitched to reach the back shelves. "To the citizens of San Angelo," he read, "and to Ranger Elliott Crane in particular. It has come to the attention of the undersigned that an error occurred in the placement of the Nashville bridal catalog. Marguerite Holt was not authorized to represent the Holt family in this arrangement. Adeline Rourke is the legitimate candidate for the position and was always intended as such. We respectfully request the return of Marguerite Holt to Nashville and offer our sincerest apologies for the confusion this may have caused." He read it twice, the second time slower, savoring the particular architecture of the sentence. The confusion this may have caused, the way a man savors a well-turned insult he did not have to compose himself. Maisie was standing near the flour barrels with a basket over one arm. She had come in for thread and had not expected to leave with anything else. She did not put a hand to her collar or her face or any of the places a woman's hands go when she is trying to hold herself together in front of witnesses. She stood very still and let every word land where it was aimed, because there was no way left to stand that would make it land anywhere softer. Sam was beside her, a forgotten peppermint stick melting a thin red line down 2 fingers he did not notice. Somewhere between an error occurred and the legitimate candidate, his hand had found Maisie's, and hers had closed around it without either of them deciding to make it so. It was a small thing, a boy's hand inside a woman's, sticky with sugar, and it was the only steady thing in the room. Across the street, in the shade of the awning outside Truett's, Eli Crane had his back to the mercantile door and had not expected to meet the Holt's business through an open door at 11 in the morning, carried on Chester Mum's auction voice, loud enough to reach a man who was not even trying to listen. He heard no attributes of note nowhere in it, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man recognizing a wound reopened rather than a new one dealt, that the letter did not need those words to do the same work. Return of Marguerite Holt, as though a boy's whole voice, given back to him one plain sentence at a time, could be folded up and shipped to Nashville in a crate marked Error. Eli turned, not a fast thing, but the turn of a man who has run out of patience for being late, and did not go into the mercantile. He went to find Judge Pierce instead, because a ranger who had learned anything at all in this life had learned that a public wound wants a public remedy, or it festers. Fort Concho held its civil hour on Fridays, in the packed dirt yard between the officers' quarters and the old stone commissary, where Judge Aldous Pierce heard the small disputes of a county too young to have built itself a proper courthouse. By the time Eli walked into that yard with his hat under his arm, word had traveled ahead of him, and more citizens had gathered along the fence rail than the yard had seen in a long season of Fridays. Chester Mum was there, the letter still folded in his coat. Miss Bragg was there, having closed the schoolhouse early on a pretext nobody troubled to examine. Adeline Rourke stood near the gate in traveling silk gone dusty at the hem, her composure intact, but her eyes moving over the crowd with the first uncertainty she had shown since stepping down from the carriage. Eli did not ask the judge for Maisie's hand, though half the yard had come expecting exactly that kind of theater. He asked for something with less romance in it and more permanence. He asked that the emergency guardianship registration he had filed in Maisie Holt's name, the paper that had first anchored her in San Angelo against her own family's convenience, be set aside, and that in its place the court enter Marguerite Holt as legal co-guardian of Samuel Crane, with full and equal standing to his own, not for a season, not until further notice, but as a matter of permanent record. It was not a proposal, it was a fortification. He was not asking to keep a bride. He was building, in front of Chester Mum and the schoolteacher and Adeline Rourke and half the county, a wall around the one bond in his son's life that no letter from Nashville would ever again have the standing to touch. Judge Pierce, who had presided over enough Friday mornings to know when a courtroom held more than a boundary dispute, looked over his spectacles at the boy standing very straight at Maisie's side, and did what the informal custom of that yard allowed him to do in matters touching a child. "Samuel," the judge said, not unkindly, This concerns you as much as anyone standing here. Do you have anything you'd like to say?" The yard went the particular kind of quiet that settles over a crowd remembering all at once that it has been 3 years since this boy last said anything to a stranger at all. Sam did not look at the judge. He did not look at Adeline Rourke, standing dusty and diminished by the gate, nor at Chester Mum, with a folded letter still in his coat, nor at his father, who stood with his hat still under his arm and his whole life arranged, without quite saying so, around whatever answer came next. He looked at Maisie. "She stays," Sam said. 2 words, plain as the ones he'd used for a hot skillet, carrying in them everything the yard did not need explained to it. A silence broken and kept broken, a hand found sticky with peppermint in a room gone cold, a whole family's arithmetic of value turned over and found wanting by a 6-year-old who had never once needed a ledger to know what a person was worth. Nobody in that yard mistook it for a small thing. Adeline Rourke did not wait for the judge to rule. She had come to San Angelo to collect a substitution, not to stand witness to a boy choosing a woman her own family had priced at nothing, and there was no version of that yard that was going to hand her back her dignity. She turned before the paperwork was even called for, found her driver with a single look, and was back through the gate before the dust of her own arrival had properly settled. Nobody stopped her. Nobody, it was noted afterward, even said goodbye. Chester Mum took the letter out of his coat once, as though he meant to do something with it, read it again perhaps for an audience that no longer wanted it, and then thought better of it. He folded it back along its crease, the same crease Eunice Holt's own hand had pressed into it in Nashville, and put it away in his pocket without a word. It was the first time in living memory that Chester Mum had held a piece of news in his hands and chosen not to share it. The judge granted the guardianship without further argument. There was, in truth, no one left standing in that yard to argue against it. It would be some weeks before the postmaster in San Angelo handed Cyrus Holt's original advertisement back across a Nashville counter, returned through the mail the way a piece of merchandise is returned when the buyer has changed his mind. The same catalog page, the same ink, no attributes of note, available immediately, folded exactly as he had folded it the day he wrote it. Cyrus Holt turned the envelope over before he opened it, out of some old habit of caution, and held it to the lamp, and found on the back a single line pressed into the paper in charcoal, in a hand that was not his daughter's, nor his wife's, nor any hand belonging to a grown correspondent at all. 6 words, maybe 7, scratched by a hand still learning where letters ought to sit on a line, some of them leaning, one doubled back over itself where the boy had pressed too hard and had to start the loop again. "She is not what you said," that was all. No signature. A boy of 6 does not yet know that a thing like this needs one. No flourish. Charcoal does not allow for flourish, only for what the hand is sure of. Cyrus Holt sat with it a long while at his own dinner table, his wife asleep upstairs, and the catalog itself, long since burned in a fit of temper, neither of them spoke of afterward. He did not show it to Eunice. He did not show it to anyone. A man who had built a small, comfortable cruelty out of the words no attributes of note had, it turned out, no words at all for a child's plain correction of him. And he kept the envelope in a drawer for the rest of his life, and never once mentioned San Angelo again in his own house. Maisie did not go back to Nashville. There was no morning when she announced it, no letter refusing the return that had never, in truth, been hers to refuse. She simply did not go. The season that had been measured out until Sunday, then we'll see, passed the way weeks do when no one is counting them anymore, and one day the counting had simply stopped. The town noticed before she did. It was Odalie Finch, of all people, the same woman who had asked in her first week whether Maisie could at least cook, who stopped her outside the Mercantile one October morning and said, without any of the old appraisal in her voice, "Maisie, could you spare a moment?" And it took her the better part of the walk home to understand what had changed. Not the sentence, the name inside it. San Angelo had spent a first week weighing her the way a buyer weighs a bolt of cloth held up to poor light, and now it simply called her by the name her mother had given her, the one nobody in Nashville had thought worth using twice in a sentence that also included the word available. On a Saturday, with the first cold coming down off the plains, Eli walked with her to the Kimball boarding house to collect what she had brought with her, the whole of it fitting still in the same small trunk and the same single case that had come off the train some months before. Mrs. Kimball cried a little at the door, in the unembarrassed way of a woman who had grown fond of a boarder without quite planning to, and pressed a jar of preserves into the case at the last moment as though the weight of it needed excusing. Eli did not say much on the walk back. He carried the case in one hand, the way he carried most things that mattered to him, without ceremony, as if ceremony might frighten off whatever good had settled in his life if he looked at it too directly. At the gate, he set the case down to work the latch and looked at it a moment, small and scuffed and light enough to have carried the length of Texas without complaint. "You came light," he said. It was not quite a question. It was the kind of thing a man says when he has spent a year learning to say less and mean more by it. An accounting of sorts of how little she had asked to bring into his house and how much of it she had left standing in it since. "I knew I'd stay," Maisie said. She said it the way she said most things now, plainly, without reaching for more weight than the words could carry on their own. Though anyone who had watched her fold an envelope with 2 thumbs, or sit silent on a cold floor beside a boy with a boot he meant to master himself, would have understood that 4 words could carry a great deal in the right hands. Sam was waiting at the door when they came up the path, standing very straight the way he had learned to stand in a courtroom yard some weeks before, and in his arms, held flat and careful, the way a boy holds something he has decided is worth the trouble of not creasing, were 3 sheets of old feed paper gone soft with handling. The 3 figures in charcoal, drawn and redrawn across a whole year, the small one always between the 2 tall ones now, never trailing behind. He did not run to them. He had never been a boy who ran to anyone. He simply stood in the doorway and waited, the way he had waited on a crate at the station once, holding a sign that had said only a name, and let them come the rest of the way to him. There are people in this world who are looked at and priced in a glance by those who have never once troubled to look longer. And there are, now and again, those few who are looked at by someone who was never taught to do that. A child, most often, before the world has finished teaching him how to look away from what does not announce its own worth. It was a boy of 6 who saw what a family of grown men and women in a well-lit parlor in Nashville had somehow missed entirely. Some things can only be seen by someone who was never taught to look away. Perhaps there is someone like that in your own life, someone you weighed too quickly once in poor light and were wrong about. Or perhaps you were the one being weighed and know exactly what it costs to stand still while it happens, and what it means when, at last, someone refuses to look away. Tell me, in the comments below, which side of this story you felt most, and if it found something in you worth staying for, stay a little longer. There is always another story waiting here for you.